The first thing Cale Marin did every morning was load a gun he never intended to fire. It was a ritual, not a threat. The pistol was old, a GR7 sidearm, standard colonial fleet issue, decommissioned before most of the kids on this station were born. The grip was worn smooth on the right side where his palm had rested for 11 years, and the firing mechanism had been modified 3 times by people who knew their work. He would pick it up from the shelf beside the bunk, check the chamber out of habit, press the barrel briefly against his sternum where the scar began, and set it back down. Some mornings he did this without getting up at all. He lay in the dark of the crawler's bunk compartment listening to the dock sounds, hydraulic clamps releasing, service drones cycling through diagnostics, the low percussion of cargo crates being slid into freight bays, and he pressed the barrel there and held it and breathed. He never pulled the trigger. He never had. But he counted. Every morning he counted the number of times he had not pulled it, and when the number felt big enough, he got up. Today the number was 1,462. He got up. The Outer Reach station, they called Pharaoh's Hook, had been built into the belly of an asteroid that nobody wanted, in a system that the Dominion had bypassed during their first expansion wave, and returned to only when they needed a fuel routing hub far enough from the core lanes that the transit taxes didn't apply. The asteroid was called HD9 in the charts. The people who lived here, the dock workers, the fisherfolk who ran the skimmer nets through the ring debris looking for processable ore, the mechanics who kept machines alive in vacuum, called it the gut, because that was what it smelled like inside. Recycled air and old hydrocarbons and something organic that no maintenance crew had ever successfully identified. Cale had come to Pharaoh's Hook 14 months ago. He'd arrived on a cargo hauler, paid his transit fare in work rather than credits, and asked the dockmaster for any job that kept him off the main transit corridors. The dockmaster, a broad Terran woman named Zelda who had the flat, efficient eyes of someone who had stopped asking questions about people's pasts, gave him a bunk and a maintenance route, and said the hours were bad and the pay was worse and he could start tomorrow. He said that was fine. He had been a killer. He'd been good at it, better than good. The syndicate paid contractors like Cale in 2 currencies, credits and silence, and he had collected both in quantity over a decade of work that he'd told himself, for most of that decade, was just business. He'd been careful not to look too closely at what the business produced. He'd been careful not to ask what happened after. Then one night in a syndicate safe house on Alara station, a contact had been late, and Cale had found himself with nothing to do but look at a wall screen showing a news feed, and the feed had been running a story about a family found in a debris field 3 light towers from Callisto Point, and he'd recognized the ship. He'd recognized the ship because he'd set it on that trajectory 6 days before. He'd believed the manifest when they told him the ship was carrying Dominion intelligence assets. He'd done it clean and he'd walked away and he hadn't looked back. He looked back now. The family had been a husband, a wife, and a 9-year-old boy named Davy who had apparently drawn pictures of space whales on the walls of his cabin in red crayon while the ship drifted. The newsreader said it like it meant something. Cale didn't know if it did. He knew it meant something that he couldn't stop seeing those crayon marks when he closed his eyes. He'd left the syndicate the next morning. Not cleanly. Not with their blessing. He'd taken what he needed and burned the access codes he'd been given and walked out of the syndicate's sphere of operations with the knowledge that the man they called the architect, the one who ran collections and contracts in the outer systems, would eventually come looking. He'd spent 2 years staying ahead of that eventually. Now he maintained machinery on an asteroid nobody wanted in a system the syndicate barely tracked, and every morning he counted the number of days he had not added to a toll that already sat on his chest like a stone, and he told himself that was enough. Some mornings he believed it. The trouble started with a fisherman. His name was Augusto, and he was the kind of man who went about his life with the quiet dignity of someone who had made peace with its small dimensions. He was not young. The ring skimmer work aged people faster than gravity did, the constant low-level radiation from the ore dust settling into joints and lung tissue. And he had a son named Pedo who was 11 years old and spent most of his time at the station's tiny learning terminal because Augusto refused to let him come out on the skimmer runs. Pedo had a condition, something cardiac, something congenital. The station's medic had explained it twice and used words that Augusto had written down and looked up later, and then folded the paper and kept it in his chest pocket like a wound. Cale knew Augusto the way he knew most people here, through the maintenance routes, through the shared silences of the dock. They had never spoken much. Cale didn't speak much to anyone. But he knew which bunk was Augusto's, knew which skimmer the man flew, knew that Pedo came to the dock gate every evening to meet his father when the nets came in. The night Augusto's skimmer came back riding low and moving wrong, Cale was finishing a conduit repair 3 bays over and noticed, because he noticed everything by instinct he could not unlearn. Augusto had found something in the debris field, something significant enough that he'd spent 20 minutes on the comm with his sister Antonia before he docked, voice low and tense, before he realized the dock comms were shared infrastructure and went quiet. Cale didn't know what it was. He didn't ask. He went back to his conduit and finished the splice and told himself it was none of his concern. 3 days later, syndicate contractors arrived on Pharaoh's Hook. They came on a transit freighter, 6 of them, registered as equipment inspectors for a company that Cale recognized from a decade ago as a syndicate front operation. He saw them through a viewport while running morning checks on the seal integrity of Dock 4. He counted them twice. He noted the way they moved, not like inspectors, not with the mild territorial anxiety of people doing regulatory work, but with the loose, rehearsed readiness of people who were waiting to do something they'd already done many times before. He went back to his bunk. He sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time without picking up the pistol. Then he picked it up. Then he set it down again. He looked at the ceiling, which was bare rock, the original asteroid material that the station builders had not bothered to panel over, and he thought about the crayon marks. Red, the news feed had said. He didn't know why it mattered what color. He thought about Augusto's skimmer riding low. He thought about Pedo at the dock gate every evening. He thought about the paper Augusto carried in his chest pocket, folded small. He thought about what contractors like the ones currently on Dock 7 did when they wanted something from a fisherman on an asteroid nobody cared about in a system the syndicate barely tracked. He picked the pistol up again. He held it against his chest. He breathed. He set it back down, and this time when he stood up, he wasn't thinking about the number. What Augusto had found in the debris field was a Dominion courier capsule, a hardened transit container about the size of a ground vehicle, designed to survive in debris fields for up to 6 months while broadcasting a low-frequency recovery signal on a frequency that only Dominion fleet transponders were tuned to pick up. Augusto's skimmer didn't have a Dominion transponder. It had an ore scanner that happened to be miscalibrated in a way that made it sensitive to exactly the frequency the capsule was broadcasting, because Augusto had modified the scanner himself 12 years ago and had never quite gotten it back to factory spec. The capsule contained currency blocks. Old ones, pre-Dominion expansion Terran Federation certified currency blocks, the kind that had been out of standard circulation for 30 years, but that any bonded exchange house in the outer systems would convert at a rate that would make Augusto's eyes water. There were enough of them to pay for Pedo's surgery, the real surgery, at a proper medical facility with a staff cardiologist and a recovery ward, and a success rate that didn't require Augusto to spend the nights doing math in his head 3 times over. Augusto had told his sister. His sister had told him to report it to the station authority, which was what you were supposed to do with Dominion property found in the ring debris. Augusto had told his sister he was thinking about it. He was thinking about a lot of things. He was thinking about the paper in his chest pocket, and the words he'd looked up, and the expression on Pito's face the last time the station medic had used those words in the boy's presence. Cale learned most of this from Antonia herself, which he had not anticipated. She came to find him. She'd been asking around the dock quietly, asking who she could trust, asking who had been here long enough to know things, and two separate people had said the quiet maintenance man who kept the East Corridor life support array from killing everyone in their sleep might be worth talking to. She was not the kind of woman who would come to a stranger easily. She had the look of someone who had survived on a station like this for long enough to know exactly how much trust cost and exactly what it bought. She came to Cale's bunk section during the midshift break when the corridor was empty, and she told him what Augusto had found and what she was afraid was going to happen, and she looked at him like she was trying to see through his face to whatever was underneath. He didn't say much. He asked her two questions: how long since the contractors arrived, and had Augusto moved the capsule from his skimmer? 2 days, she said, and no, he didn't know what to do with it. Cale thought about this. He said he needs to get his son off the station first. The boy needs to be somewhere else before anything else happens. She said, there's a supply shuttle leaving in 18 hours for the Callisto Transit Hub. If Pito was on it with travel papers and enough credits for passage. He said he'd handle the credits. She looked at him for a long time. She said, who are you? He said, I used to be someone else. He's going to be fine. Get the boy on the shuttle. The first contractor he dealt with wasn't looking for him. That was important. The man was coming off the secondary access corridor that ran behind the fuel storage bays, and he was moving the way people moved when they were doing reconnaissance, methodical, mapping exits. Cale came out of a maintenance alcove behind him, which took care of the geography problem, and the rest of it was over in about 8 seconds. He'd been faster once. He was still fast enough. He left the man zip-tied to a support strut with a piece of conduit tape over his mouth, and a mild concussion that would keep him confused for several hours. He felt the old knowledge coming back with a nausea that had nothing to do with the body mechanics of it. He'd been afraid of this, that it would feel familiar in a way that he couldn't separate from something like comfort. It didn't feel comfortable. It felt like putting on a coat he'd hoped to never wear again and finding that it still fit. He found the second contractor in the transit lounge, which was messier because there were other people present. And what Cale did was sit down across from the man and say, very quietly, that the operation he was on had just become more complicated than whoever sent him understood, and that his employer would like to speak with him privately before anything else happened. The contractor had the specific stillness of a professional who was processing threat assessment and coming up with a number he didn't like. He said, who sent you? Cale said, that's what your employer wants to discuss. Dock 9, 30 minutes. He stood up and walked away without looking back. The contractor didn't follow him immediately, which meant he was going to make a comm call first. That was expected. Cale had planned for about 12 minutes of comm time before the man appeared at Dock 9, which was enough. There was no one at Dock 9 except Cale. The second contractor did not leave Dock 9 under his own power. The third and fourth contractors were together, which was inefficient of them from a tactical standpoint but understandable from a human one. They'd clearly been briefed that something had gone wrong with Contractor 1, and they were scared. Scared people bunch up. Cale understood this. He'd been scared himself in the early years before he'd learned not to be, before he'd learned that learning not to be scared was itself the thing he should have been frightened of. He came at them from the maintenance access above the cargo bay, dropped between them before either could orient, and 3 seconds later one of them was on the floor holding his knee, and the other was pinned against a cargo container being held in place by exactly enough force to communicate that Kale could do considerably more if he chose to. He said, "I need to know where your command post is." The contractor he was holding said something physically impossible. Kale applied a small amount of additional pressure to a specific point on the man's shoulder and waited. The contractor told him where the command post was. He did not go to the command post immediately. Instead, he went back to his bunk section, which was a calculated risk he took deliberately. He sat on the bunk and he held the pistol with the barrel against his sternum and he breathed. He counted something, not the number this time, but a different kind of inventory. How many people were still alive who had been in his way tonight? All of them. He'd been precise about that, more precise than he'd been precise about anything in the months of maintenance work where precision meant the difference between a corridor full of breathable air and a corridor full of not. He thought about the boy named Pito who drew pictures of things, probably, the way boys did. He thought about the boy named Davy who had drawn space whales in red crayon. He thought about the distance between those two boys and the things he had and hadn't done in the years between them. He set the pistol down. He got up. He went to deal with the command post. The man running the operation was not one of the 6 contractors Kale had tallied at the dock. He was a 7th, a coordinator who had stayed in the rented compartment in the station's transit quarter and was running the whole thing remotely. He was a young man, younger than Kale expected, maybe 30, 32, with the slightly over-coordinated manner of someone who had done management training for field work, without quite enough field work to roughen the edges. He knew Kale's face when Kale came through the door, which meant the architect's network had circulated a file. Kale had expected this. The coordinator said, "You're Marin." Kale said yes. The coordinator said, "We weren't here for you." Kale said, "I know, you're here for the fishermen." The coordinator said, "The capsule is syndicate property. The transit code on it goes back to a recovery operation from 30 years ago that's still technically open. The man who found it is in violation of." Kale said, "The man who found it is going to use it to pay for his son's surgery. The boy has a congenital cardiac condition. He's 11 years old." The coordinator was quiet. Kale said, "Call the architect." The coordinator said, "I can't just." Kale said, "Call him." There was a pause that had several things in it: calculation, fear, professional self-preservation. Then the coordinator made the call. The architect's real name was something Kale had known once and had let go of, the way he'd let go of several other things that it cost too much to carry. On the screen the man looked older than Kale remembered, or maybe just more settled, the way predators settle when they haven't had to run in a long time. He looked at Kale the way Kale imagined a person might look at a debt they'd assumed was uncollectible. He said, "Marin." Kale said, "I'm going to make this simple." The architect said, "You don't have a position to make things from." Kale said, "I have 6 of your people in varying states of inconvenience and a coordinator who is going to need a new assignment after tonight. I also have the coordinates of the capsule, which your coordinator doesn't have because I asked the fishermen to move it this afternoon before your people started looking. You can have the capsule. The fisherman and his family walk. The boy gets on the shuttle in the morning." The architect was quiet for long enough that Kale could hear the station's environmental systems cycling through their hourly check. The architect said, "Why?" Kale said, "The boy is 11 years old." The architect said, "That's not an answer." Kale said, "It's the only one I have." Another pause, longer this time. The architect looked at something off-screen, and Kale watched his face go through 3 calculations that were visible only if you knew how to read the kind of face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. The architect said, "The capsule." Kale said, "The fisherman gives you the coordinates. You send a recovery team. Nobody touches the family." The architect said, "And you?" Kale said, "I'm going to keep not being a problem for you. I'm good at it. I've had 14 months of practice. The architect said, "You've been running maintenance on an asteroid nobody wants." Kale said, "Yes." The architect said, "Why?" Kale looked at the man on the screen for a moment. He thought about the pistol on the shelf. He thought about the number and the counting and the reason for the counting. He said, "I'm paying for something." The architect studied him. Whatever the man was, whatever he'd built and run and ordered done across a career that had touched hundreds of lives in the outer systems, he was not incapable of recognition. He was old enough and observant enough to recognize the specific weight of what Kale was describing, even if he would have called it something different in his own accounting. He said, "The capsule." Kale said, "The family." "A beat." The architect said, "Agreed." Kale sat outside Dock 9 until the supply shuttle from Callisto Transit Hub came in on schedule, and the boarding queue opened up and he watched, from a safe distance, the small figure of a boy with a backpack that was slightly too large for him walk up the boarding ramp holding his father's hand. Augusto looked around at the dock one last time before he went up the ramp. Kale didn't know if the man was looking for him specifically. He stayed back. He wasn't good at the part that came after. He had never been good at it. The training he'd had was for the other parts. Antonia was there. She was holding a bag and Pito's drawing tablet, and she was talking to the boy in the low, steady way of someone making a long journey manageable by talking it into small segments. She was the kind of person who made things manageable. Kale had noticed that. He noticed most things. The shuttle closed its boarding ramp, and the dock cleared, and the docking arm released, and the shuttle moved out of the bay with the slow hydraulic grace of something designed to carry people safely through vacuum. And Kale watched it until the dock viewport showed nothing but the stars and the turning geometry of the ring debris that Augusto had been skimming for long enough to know it like a second language. He stayed there for a while. The dock around him was settling back into its ordinary night rhythms. A service drone completing its sweep route, a seal integrity alarm from Bay 6 that was probably just the temperature differential between the station's inner skin and the asteroid rock, the kind of thing he'd learned to read without thinking. The life of the station continued in its low, constant, industrial key, and Kale stood in the middle of it and felt something that he wouldn't have been able to name accurately, but that sat in his chest differently from the stone. What he had not anticipated was the scorpion. He should have. He'd known, in a general way, that the architect had not operated alone in the outer systems for 20 years. He'd known that the man ran contractors the way a careful administrator ran assets, distributed, compartmentalized, not all aware of each other's assignments. What he had not fully modeled was the possibility that the architect's call, his agreement with Kale, the thing that should have closed the transaction, would have been monitored by a second operator who had his own interest in Kale Marin and who would have seen in the architect's sudden flexibility not a pragmatic business decision, but a provocation. The Scorpion's name in the files was Veth. He had been in the outer systems longer than Kale, longer than most people who did the work they both had done, and he had survived that long by a combination of exceptional competence and the kind of personal commitment to his own accounting that made him dangerous in ways that pure professionalism didn't explain. He had a history with Kale that the architect's file would have contained, and that Kale had not fully processed when he'd chosen to surface. 3 years before Kale had left the syndicate, there had been a contract that had gone wrong in a way that still showed up in his accounting in a specific column. The target had been a syndicate defector. The defector had not been alone. Kale had not known. He'd been told it was a clean solo target, and in the execution of the contract, he had accidentally killed the defector's partner. The partner had been the Scorpion's son. The Scorpion had done what the Scorpion did after that. He'd found Kale, and he'd found Kale's wife, who had been 6 months pregnant with their first child, and he'd made Kale pay in the specific currency that the Scorpion understood to be appropriate, which was loss for loss, and then he'd left Kale alive because alive was worse. He'd left Kale with the GR7 pistol, one bullet. Kale had pulled the trigger 3 times. The chamber had been empty all 3 times. He'd understood later that this was intentional. The Scorpion's sense of justice included survival as a punishment. You don't get to not live with it. Kale had lived with it for 3 years of running, and then 14 months of not running. And the morning he'd held the pistol against his sternum and counted 1,462 was the morning the Scorpion arrived on Pharaoh's Hook on a ship that wasn't on the dock manifest. Kale became aware of this the way he became aware of most things, not through any single signal, but through the accumulation of small wrongnesses that his body processed faster than his thinking mind. A variance in the dock's pressure differential, a maintenance drone that had been rerouted, a reflection in a viewport that didn't belong to anyone who should have been in that corridor. He moved. He'd been on his way back to his bunk from the talk with the architect's coordinator. He changed direction mid-corridor without breaking stride, turned into the maintenance access that ran parallel to the main transit corridor, killed his personal comm to remove the signal signature, and started moving with purpose through the parts of the station that only maintenance workers and the station's own systems had reason to be in. The Scorpion found him anyway. This was not a surprise. The Scorpion was extraordinarily good. He had always been extraordinarily good. He'd been good in ways that Kale, in the old life, had privately respected the way you respected a force of nature, not with approval but with the honest acknowledgement that something was exactly what it was. They came face to face in the secondary access corridor that ran behind the fuel storage bays, which had the aesthetic quality of symmetry that Kale would have appreciated in different circumstances, since it was the same corridor where he dealt with the first of the architect's contractors several hours ago. The Scorpion looked the same as Kale remembered. That was the thing about people like him, they stopped showing the wear. It all went inside. He said, "You've gotten slower." Kale said, "I haven't been practicing." The Scorpion said, "I know what you did tonight, the fisherman, the boy." Kale said, "And?" The Scorpion said, "It doesn't mean anything. You don't get to, it doesn't work that way. One thing doesn't cancel another." Kale said, "I know that." The Scorpion said, "Then why?" Kale said, "Because a thing can be true without canceling anything. The boy needed to get off the station. That was true. The other things are also true. Both things can be true at once." The Scorpion was quiet. His eyes were doing the thing they did, running assessments, calculating angles. He was standing in a corridor that was narrow enough to limit certain approaches and wide enough to allow others, and Kale was doing the same calculation simultaneously, because some things were too deeply written to stop doing. The Scorpion said, "I owed you a death." Kale said, "I know." The Scorpion said, "You pulled the trigger 3 times." Kale said, "I know that too." The Scorpion said, "And yet." Kale said, "And yet." There was a silence between them that held about a decade of wreckage. 2 men in a maintenance corridor on an asteroid nobody wanted, and between them, the accumulated weight of what people like them had done in the name of things that had long since stopped being nameable. The Scorpion said, "I should kill you." Kale said, "You might. I'm not going to make it easy." The Scorpion said, "You never did." And then the Scorpion did something Kale had not modeled for, which was reach into his jacket and take out the stylized pistol. The one he'd carried since before Kale had met him, the one with the cross-hatch grip that was the Scorpion's only personal affectation in a life otherwise stripped of them. And he looked at it. He said, "I looked for you for 2 years." Kale said, "I know, I was running." The Scorpion said, "And then you stopped." Kale said, "Yes." The Scorpion said, "On this rock, fixing machines." Kale said, "Yes." The Scorpion looked at him with the flat, assessing eyes of someone who had seen too many kinds of man, and was trying to place this one in a category he didn't quite have. He said, "How many days?" Kale understood what he was asking. He said 1,462, as of this morning. The scorpion was still for a long time. He said, "My son was 23 years old." Kale said, I know how old he was." The scorpion said, "He wanted to be a navigator. He had the certifications already. He was saving for a ship." Kale said nothing. There was nothing to say that didn't cost more than he had. The scorpion said, "I spent 2 years wanting to watch you die. Then I spent a year deciding which way. Then I spent another year not being able to." He looked at the pistol in his hand. He said, "I know what it costs to run from who you were. I know what it costs to stop running." Kale said, "Are you running from something?" The scorpion said, "I've been running from the same thing you have, longer." Another silence. The station breathed around them, the environmental systems, the pressure differential hiss, the low percussion of the dock in its ordinary night life. The scorpion said, "I'm going to walk out of this station. I'm going to tell the architect that Kale Marin is dead." Kale was very still. The scorpion said, "That gives you I don't know how long until someone checks, until the story stops holding." Kale said, "Why?" The scorpion looked at him for a long time. He said, 1,462 days. My son was 23. He was saving for a ship. He had the certifications. He put the stylized pistol back inside his jacket. He said, "Don't waste it." And he walked past Kale down the maintenance corridor and around the corner and away. And Kale stood in the empty corridor and listened to the station breathe. He went back to his bunk. He sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, and he picked up the GR7, and he held it against his chest where the scar was, and he breathed. He didn't count anything. After a while, he set the pistol down on the shelf, and he lay back and stared at the ceiling, which was bare asteroid rock that no one had bothered to panel over. And he thought about Pito on the supply shuttle heading toward Callisto Transit Hub, probably asleep with his backpack too big tucked under the seat, probably dreaming the way 11-year-olds dream in transit deeply, without the navigation anxiety that came later. He thought about the scorpion walking out of the station. He thought about the 2 years looking and the year deciding and the year not being able to. He thought about a 23-year-old who had wanted to be a navigator and had the certifications already. He thought about saving for a ship. He thought about what it meant that 2 men who had spent years destroying things could arrive, separately and without coordination, at the same corridor on an asteroid nobody wanted, and find themselves doing something that looked, if you squinted at it right, like the beginning of something that was not destruction. He didn't know what to call it. He didn't think names were the important part. He thought about the dock master named Zelda, who had given him a bunk and a route and asked no questions. He thought about Antonia talking Pito through a shuttle ride in small segments. He thought about Augusto coming back from the ring debris riding low and moving wrong because he'd found something in the wreckage and hadn't known, yet what it was going to cost, and hadn't known, yet what it was going to make possible. Something in the wreckage. He closed his eyes. In the morning, Zelda knocked on the bunk partition at the usual hour and told him Dock 4 had a seal variance that maintenance was grading as non-emergency, but she'd prefer it looked at before the morning transit traffic. He said he'd get to it. She said, "You look like you slept for once." He said, "More or less." She looked at him with the flat, efficient eyes of someone who had stopped asking questions about people's pasts. She said, "Dock 4, east coupling, probably just the temperature differential." He said, "Probably." She left. He sat for a moment longer. The pistol was on the shelf. He picked it up the way he did every morning, checked the chamber out of habit, pressed the barrel briefly against his sternum where the scar began. He set it down. He did not count anything. He put on his maintenance kit and went out into the corridor, which smelled like recycled air and old hydrocarbons, and something organic that no maintenance crew had ever successfully identified. And he went to look at Dock 4, East Coupling, probably just the temperature differential. The station breathed around him. The dock sounds ran through their ordinary rhythms. Somewhere on a supply shuttle crossing toward Callisto Transit Hub, a boy with a too-big backpack was waking up to the faint stars outside the viewport, and the day was already doing what days did, moving, turning, requiring things of the people inside it. Cale walked the route he knew and did the work in front of him and let the morning come. The coupling was not, in fact, just the temperature differential. It was a stress fracture in the secondary seal ring, probably from the last delivery cycle. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of thing that became catastrophic if you left it. He'd need to pull the ring, replace it with the spare he had in the east storage alcove, reseat the coupling, and run the pressure check twice to be sure. He got to work. He was precise about it. He was always precise, some things you couldn't unlearn. The station continued its breathing, the dock sounds, the environmental systems, the small percussions of machinery doing what machinery did. And Cale moved through the work with the focused attention he gave to everything on this rock, not because it was meaningful in the way he'd once assigned meaning to things, but because it was in front of him, and it needed doing, and doing it correctly meant people continued to breathe. That was, he had found over 14 months, enough. It was not everything. He did not mistake it for everything. But it was enough for a morning's work, and then there would be another morning, and the number would be one higher, and he would count it or not count it or set the pistol down without counting, and that too would be enough. He replaced the seal ring. He ran the pressure check. He ran it again. The coupling held. Outside, through the asteroid rock and the station skin and the vacuum beyond, the ring debris continued its slow turn through the system, and somewhere in it was a recovery team the architect had sent for a courier capsule that had been drifting for 30 years, and somewhere else a ship carried a family toward a surgical center that had a cardiologist and a recovery ward and a success rate that didn't require anyone to do math in the dark. And somewhere beyond the station's range, a man who had wanted to kill Cale Marin for 2 years was walking whatever path he was walking now. And on Pharaoh's Hook, in the east coupling of Dock 4, a maintenance worker ran the pressure check a third time because he was precise, and waited for the seal integrity to confirm green. And when it did, he gathered his tools and noted the repair in the maintenance log, and walked back through the corridor that smelled like recycled air and everything that had ever been breathed in it. He walked the route. He did the work. The morning continued.